Hello there.
What a political move to stick two fingers up at Suella Braverman.
Politics at Jack and Sam's is the podcast where we tell you what's going to happen next week in the wild world of Westminster.
My name is Jack Blanchard of Politico, and with me, as always, is the great Sam Coates of Sky News.
Keeping you ahead of the political agenda.
One top civil servant said to me they're 70-30 in favour of thinking something will happen as soon as Monday.
Sam, is it going to happen, yes or no?
Listen to Politics at Jack and Sam's wherever you get your podcasts.
Right, okay, let's go. Welcome to Electoral Dysfunction. Now, I'm in the studio. I'm just back from a 2-day whistle-stop tour of Europe with the PM and a pack of other political editors and journalists, and I'll talk about that a bit later. Now, Jess, where are you?
I'm in Birmingham, where I have mainly been this week because I am stationed back in the middle of the country for the mayoral elections.
It's local election week next week and mayoral elections, and it's going to be an absolute blockbuster. So we're going to do a lot of that next week. But Ruth, where are you?
I'm in sunny East Lothian today. I'm in my house where I'm being slightly confined to barracks, but I am also making a guest appearance on a phone bank for the Tory candidate at the West Midlands mayoral election next week. So I'm doing what I can from the house, but there's no leaflet posting, I'm afraid.
How's your shoulder?
I slightly ran out of my painkillers that the hospital had given me this week, and I thought, do you know what would be grand? I'll just take paracetamol and ibuprofen and I'll see how I do. It lasted about a day and a half. I had to phone the GP and I was like, please give me the good stuff, please.
On this episode, the Prime Minister has had a big week trying to get on top. Katie Balls, the brilliant political editor at The Spectator, she called it the Shore Up Sunak week, and I wish I'd thought of that because that is kind of what it was. So we're going to talk a bit about how he got on. Plus, what kind of a week has Vladimir Putin been having now the West has agreed this package of aid for Ukraine? And we'll hear from one of our dysfunctionals. We're not sure, is that a thing? Should we call them the dysfunctionals? One of our listeners, Justine.
Given some of the more rum antics we've seen in the present Parliament, what would an MP have to do to not be reselected?
In fact, a few of you are asking about vetting politicians, so we'll come on to that in a bit and we'll answer Justine's question. But remember, if you want to get involved and send us a question or a comment, you can WhatsApp voice note us on 07934 200 444. That's 07934 200 444. Email us to electoraldysfunction@sky.uk. Well, look, let's start with that busy week for the Prime Minister. He has been in Poland, Berlin. He's now back in London, as am I. I'm nearly dead. I don't know how he's doing, but it was absolutely an insane itinerary. And he also got the Rwanda bill through Parliament this week. So, Ruth, is he on top this week? How's he doing, the PM?
Well, I mean, I think there is a long-standing tradition in this country that if you're finding things a bit sticky at home, you try and get yourself abroad for a bit. And lots of PMs have done it, and it works for them, and that's why they keep doing it. But yeah, I mean, I think in terms of, you know, if you had a sliding scale of good to bad weeks that the Prime Minister's had, like he's had some real shockers recently. So actually, to this week, I think is probably for him one of the better weeks that he's had in his premiership. You always look a bit bigger if you're on the world stage, and that's part of the point of doing it. You're trying to flex being Prime Minister going into an election and looking prime ministerial. And no big gaffes, no big missteps, nothing's fallen apart. You've come back enthused, Beth. Listen to you, sounded like you've just had the best sort of half-term break that a political journalist can have. So I guess, you know, being fair to him, it sounds like he's had a good couple of days.
Let's go through the week then, because he started off with Rwanda. Now, neither of you like this policy for different reasons, but you both don't particularly like the policy. But I have to say, on Monday morning, as I was contemplating going to the gym, I got a message from the news desk at 7 a.m. going, you're not going to the gym, you're going to number 10 because there is a PM press conference. So straight out of the traps on Monday with his operational plan. He's going to get flights away in a regular rhythm from July onwards. He wouldn't put numbers on how many asylum seekers he wanted to send to Rwanda to have have their claims processed. But it wasn't the odd flight. It was a pattern of flights. He had an airfield ready. He's got commercial flights on standby. He's recruited people to process the claims. He's got courts ready to sit and hear legal appeals. I mean, basically, he's a prime minister that was trying to convey to us all that he has a plan. Ruth, you're shaking your head. Jess, you've fallen off your chair. No, you haven't really.
It's bullshit. Everything he said is total bullshit. The reason he can't put numbers on it is because it's not true. It's not real. The idea that Rishi Sunak controls what judges do is for the birds. It's literally not in his purview to identify 150 judges. He cannot answer any questions about when the flights are going to take off, who the flights are going to be with. I actually think it was a sort of a bit of a misstep. And the trouble with Rishi Sunak and the Rwanda thing is that he hasn't read even the polling and or spoken to anyone in the country, because everybody in the country, like even the people who really like the Stop the Boats and really like the Rwanda, and I'm willing to admit that unlike me, both on moral and logistical reasons, I am against it. Unlike me, there is, quite a hefty part of the population who agree with this policy. However, none of them agree that it will actually work to stop the boats.
Okay, talking about the misstep, at the press conference, the question I asked him was, is this a moment of success for you? And how many people do you feel you need to send to Rwanda to make this policy look effective or be effective, right? Now, the second bit of the question he just ignored. But when he said on the matter of success, Ruth, he said, success is stopping the boats. And I thought, wow.
That's a really high bar, and you're lashing yourself to something you're not going to hit. And I think, so we're talking about all of this stuff about the, what he was saying in the press conference and all of the stuff that he says he has done or that is in place or that is going to happen. And all the headlines were just flights not taking off in spring, which is what you said, mate. So even for the purpose of what the press conference was supposed to be, which was reassuring people out there who do like this policy, and I'm not one of them. I think we should, take care of our own situation. We don't put it on other countries. We shoulder our own burden in the world. We have a fair and transparent migration policy. Yes, not everybody that comes here gets to stay, but we need to process claims faster. And there's a whole host of really serious reasons. But just from the optics of the people that might even like this, the only thing they heard was the Prime Minister saying, we're not doing it in the spring like we said we would. That's the bit that came across. So it was already a back foot press conference for me, looking at the comms of it. And also, what Jess says, even people who are desperate to reduce migration, to see people not cross the channel, like we saw this week and the casualties that involves and that horrific loss of life, they don't think this is going to work.
So imagine a world in which he does get the flights away. There is a regular rhythm of flights going through the summer. He then at least presumably can go to the electorate and say, I said I was going to do it. Our plan is working. I've actually got these flights away. This is how we're going to deal with illegal migration. Labour don't have a plan. And Jess, I know you'll say they do have a plan.
Repeatedly said that they've got a plan, yeah.
Yeah, but is there not another world in which he looks like a man who in the end, despite the hurdles, did what he said he would do? Ruth, can you give him no credit for this at all?
I think he's being badly advised. I think there is absolutely a way in which you can reduce the numbers and look tougher on immigration than the Labour Party. Although at the moment, what he's trying to do is claw back people that have moved to reform. And I think that's very difficult because actually, if you're of that ilk and you've done that move on those grounds on immigration, you're not going to believe that the Tory party is to the right of reform because we're not. And nor should we be, frankly. But I think the problem that he's got is doubling down on the stop the boats. Because even if he goes, and even if the messaging is in an election campaign and in the TV debates and all the rest of it, I'm doing all of this stuff, Labour would undo it, they're weaker than me on this. Doesn't even have to be Keir Starmer, but all the moderator has to do is turn around and say, you said you stopped the boats, you've only stopped them by a third, you've lied.
Like after that press conference, a couple of people did message me and say that was bad politics, like your question, he could have swerved that. But, Jess, is there a world in which these flights going away it is a bit of a problem for Labour because he looks like he is beginning to turn it around.
The reason he's picked Rwanda to lash himself to is because he can't lash himself to the actual two things that are shown repeatedly to be the most important things at the moment in the election to the British public. That is the NHS and the cost of living crisis. And he cannot deliver anything on either one of those. And he cannot get away from the fact that they've been in for 14 years. Rwanda is the only one that is slightly like, this is a new thing and we're trying something new and nobody else tried it before. This isn't new news. This is the third piece of legislation I've sat through in 4 years to get people off to Rwanda. So the idea that he's like, getting stuff done fast is like, for the birds. I've literally gone into the menopause in the time that they have I was a young woman at the beginning of the Rwanda debacle, and now I am basically a spinster on the shelf.
You've never been a young woman. You were born middle-aged, Jess. Born middle-aged.
So my mum actually used to say that. 10 going on 45.
Nothing wrong with 45.
Nothing wrong. The fact that he answered your question in the way that he answered them, I actually don't think he would have been advised to say, success is stopping the boats. But it was a moment of whether it's arrogance or hope, to be generous, that he shouldn't have said, because all anyone is now going to ask him is, remember when you said to Beth Rigby that you were going to stop the boats and that's what success, you're a failure.
I really do think this is one in which the Prime Minister, he has no option but to try and deliver some of this, because every time the hurdle has got higher, he has insisted that he will scale it and he will hit these targets. So he really has bound himself to this policy, and there perhaps is a world in which some flights get away. Now, the other thing this week in the Shore Up Sunak week, trademark Katie Balls, was this trip, this dash to Poland and Germany. With that dash across Europe, he had this big press conference with the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. He met Poland Prime Minister Donald Tusk. He went over to Germany to meet Chancellor Scholz. And as this was all happening in Europe, this week the US finally approved a £61 billion aid package, military aid for Ukraine. It had been stuck in Congress for months. So what this was this huge coordination, actually, of allies to send a message to Putin that the West was united behind Ukraine and they would do whatever it takes for as long as it takes. And then, within all of that, the Prime Minister did this big announcement on defence spending. Conservatives have been pushing him on it for months to lift our spending on defence from 2 to 2.5% of GDP. He said he'd do it by 2030. It was a big moment. Again, another big election plank. Ruth, what did you think of it all and his performance?
One, I think the most important thing is what's happened in the States. I went over to Ukraine to see what was happening last year, and my strong view before I went, and double as much since I came back, is ask them what they want, give them what they want, double it, and give them more again. Because as much as what's going on in the Middle East and what's going on in Gaza is capturing the world's attention, what is happening in Ukraine is arguably a far more geopolitically or geostrategically important conflict. What's happening in Ukraine is an autocratic and irredentist Russia that has invaded a democratic country, and if it is allowed to succeed, it will give succour to every autocrat anywhere in the world. It will show that the West is completely gelded. The entire world order will change. And if I were living in Taiwan, or if I were living in parts of Bosnia very close to Republika Srpska, or if I was living in South Korea with my neighbour to the north, I would be very, very nervous. As well as all of those other areas that were part of a greater Soviet Union that Putin clearly has his eye on once Ukraine is completed. That money has been held up is a tragedy and has cost undoubted lives, and it has cost territory in terms of the war in Ukraine. So that's been the biggest news in the world this week, I think, by a country mile. I think in terms of what Rishi has done and showing that there is cooperation on certain issues, because part of it was on security, showing that, or giving an indication. I mean, if we're realistic, given where the polls are, it's not going to be his money to spend on defence. Talking about upping defence spending for the UK, showing that we still want to play our part and be a good ally in the world and put our money where our mouth is, I think is important. So actually, in terms of the West finally getting a bit serious about Ukraine, I think has been really important. And it is important that it's not just Biden and Congress and the Republican Speaker pushing it through, that it is also America and France and Germany and the EU as a group and NATO as an organisation, that everybody has to make sure that they're speaking off the same hymn sheet on this one.
And I have to say, Jess, for me, part of the reason these trips are useful is I've got my head in UK politics, and then you're in Poland and you're in front of Stoltenberg, and he's the guy that basically runs NATO, which is the alliance of allies that have a defence agreement. So they all put a certain amount of money into defence spending. And the idea is that you are an alliance, so if one of you is attacked, it's an attack on all the countries. So, I don't spend my days listening to Stoltenberg speeches, but, you're sitting there and you have a prime minister saying, Europe's at a turning point. It's an inflection point. You have other leaders and Stoltenberg talking about how dangerous the world now is, that it's more dangerous perhaps since the 1930s. You have the Prime Minister talking about this authoritarian access of Russia, China, Iran, working, as he said to me, with more pace and intensity to destabilise our democracies. And they talked a bit too about this sort of peace dividend that we had at the end of the Cold War. And the idea of that was that after the Cold War ended and we entered this period of prolonged peace, that instead of spending money on defence, right, you could spend it on other things. You could spend it on health and education and other public services. And the message really, not just from the Prime Minister, but from Scholz in Germany, the German Chancellor, from Stoltenberg around NATO, was that European countries have to spend money on defence. And in that, Jess, the Prime Minister really did seem to throw down a challenge to Labour. Do you think that the Labour Party should follow the Prime Minister's lead on this?
People my age, I was born at the end of the Cold War, and, you sort of remember it. We have kidded ourselves, actually, that liberal democracy is the default position. And actually, liberal democracy has actually only existed for 70 years out of the entire history of human existence. And yet we have sort of sat and rested on the idea that we are safe and secure and not really ever had to worry about it. And I think that absolutely the Labour Party is committed to the exact same plan for upping defence spending. I don't think the Labour Party is quite so keen on the data that was given out by the government this week. I have to say, I think that if the Labour Party had announced something quite so big, the level of scrutiny on where that money and what was going to be cut or where it was going to be borrowed from would have been phenomenally higher.
So on this, because there was a bit of back and forth when I was over in Berlin, I sat down with some of the officials and I went, talk me through, how are you funding this? And the upshot was, as you said, Jess, they're assuming this is a bit techie. The point of it all is it's about projections of government spending over 5, 6, 7 years, right? So they assume a baseline that defence spending will go up to 2.3% of GDP at the beginning of the next parliament, right? And then they crank it up gradually to get to 2.5% by 2030. The point of all of it is for a Prime Minister politically to be able to go into an election saying, I am going to do this. I've explained to you how I am going to fund it. Keir Starmer says he is also going to do this when resources allow, but he doesn't have a plan. It's effectively like, I'm a wartime Prime Minister, you can trust me with security. That will be the argument.
Trouble is, it's really easy to argue against it because the Conservative Party for the last 14 years have made our armed forces smaller than they've been since the Napoleonic era. Lots and lots of Tory hawks, if you will, who really, really, really care about defence, have been slagging off the government for the last decade for how badly they have dropped the ball on defence, and cuts across the board, and terrible, terrible mismanagement of commissioning of various different projects. So it's really easy to argue against. Also, the polling puts the Labour Party in front of the Conservative Party on every single area of policy, including national security.
But there is a question, isn't there? Because if Rishi Sunak goes into election saying leading is about choices, this was the narrative he was building, right, when we were on the trip. Leading is about choices. I choose to prioritise defence because I think the world is really dangerous. That's my job as Prime Minister, to put the country's security first. What are Labour doing? And then you, as the Labour Party, have all this pressure about other public services to spend money on. I mean, do you think actually, more money should go into the NHS or education before it goes into defence? Because that's where they'll try and box Labour in, right?
Look, I don't necessarily think that it's an entirely binary choice. And when he says he's going to cut 70,000 civil servants, most civil servants aren't, the 5 people you see sat in the little box in the chamber of the House of Commons. Most civil servants are the Passport Office. They're going to shut it. The Border Force, they're civil servants. Going to get rid of Border Force, are you? The idea that there's 70,000 people sat in Whitehall departments, when he says he's cutting civil servants, what he means is your job centres are shutting. The DVLA, what's he going to do?
Ruth, you talked about being in Ukraine and how that had reinforced your views on this. Did you think it was an astute move by the Prime Minister? Do you think that he can make this a dividing line with Labour, or, Jess doesn't? And I can see why, because, I have seen the photos of Keir Starmer in military fatigues in front of a tank. Yeah, he has gone there. Do you think he can make this a dividing line at the election?
To be honest, I don't care whether he makes it a dividing line or not. We absolutely need to fund our armed forces. As somebody who, to make sure that we declare all our interests, continues to be the honorary colonel of my old regiment, because I used to be a reservist. We have got to the point where our army, which you absolutely have to be able to deploy fully at brigade strength to be able to go anywhere and do anything in the world, has got to the point where it's verging on not being able to. We appear to be trying to get our special forces to do almost everything and our traditional forces to do almost nothing. That is unsustainable. We are getting to a point where we are no longer a tier 1 military nation. We've been kind of dropping down the rankings, and that's saying nothing about the professionalism of our armed forces and our soldiers, who do an awful lot with what they have.
But Ruth, it did occur to me, though, that a Prime Minister eyeing local elections next week, 20 points behind in the polls.
When it comes to a local election, I want my bins done, I want my schools good, and I want my potholes done. That's what I care about at election time.
The people of Birmingham Yardley speak of nothing else but the 2.5 defence spending when I'm knocking the doors. I mean, honestly, it's just another example. Doing it this week, I see why there's an election, and actually, I don't think he's doing it for the local elections. Not even I think that he's that out of touch with the nation to think that it's actually coming up in the local elections. So he's not shoring himself up for the local elections. He's shoring himself up because of the local elections. He needs to look big in front of his own party, who are circling him like vultures.
You two, I love that I said that, right? So I say, is it local elections? And they both, in a very irritated way, which is a bit unfair, because I've had quite a couple of days, I'll tell you. And they're both shaking their heads at me.
We didn't even let you finish the sentence. We were like, you're so wrong.
The reason is you two were furiously shaking your heads at me. It's very disturbing. Just to go back to what Jess said, it's the party management issue, isn't it, right?
It is the party management issue, 100%.
On the plane over, what was interesting was we asked him again. He keeps saying, general elections, second half of the year. I'm like, July is second half of the year. So he is talking to an internal audience with an eye on local elections, where he's very worried that if it goes really badly wrong for him, and just to put it in context, bad for the Conservatives. I mean, if they lose half the seats like 500 seats. They're in sort of Armageddon territory, right? So he is also trying to show his party as he goes up to the locals, look, I am developing a strategy for the general election. Like, whether you think it's believable or not.
He can have some credit, I think, because, it's his last ditch attempt, and every other ditch attempt that he's made of reset or whatever he goes on about has been absolutely pilloried within seconds of him saying it. And this one is like an actual strategy. I don't think it'll work, and it's not. I have to say, the Labour Party is not like worrying. I'm not getting feverish calls from the press office or like, you've got to go out and say this. But like, this is at least a cohesive thing, and it doesn't lash itself to the 14 years.
And Ruth, do you think he's helped himself with the party this week?
Well, I think what's good about this is that it's actually authentic. It doesn't seem to run against anything that he's previously said, so it's not incompatible with his track record in politics. So it feels authentic, and it's a real thing. Like, touching and feeling, putting more guns in more soldiers' hands is something that feels real. So I do think that it's quite a smart way of shoring it up. But more power to both of your elbows, I have to say, saying this is going to be an Armageddon, saying that it's going to be over 500 seats lost. Make that bar as high as you like, because a lot of elections isn't what actually happens in terms of the fallout. It's about what the expectation management is. So if the expectation is that it's not just going to be a rout, but it's going to be an apocalypse, that actually, at this point in the cycle, works quite well for Rishi Sunak in terms of keeping his job out the back end.
Our election analyst, Michael Thrasher, professor no less, very clever man. I mean, he is talking about 500 seat losses as a really very, very challenging night for the Tories. So that's the kind of, he's sort of saying the minimal loss is 100 for Labour. He's sort of saying if they gain 350 seats, it will consolidate their position. And if they want to kind of get into Blair 97 territory, they're going to have to exceed that. So they're the sort of framing that will be put in around it. But Ruth, I don't disagree with you that if it's anything less than Armageddon at the moment for Rishi Sunak, that kind of could almost appear like a win.
I want to ask you a question about the trip. I want to ask you, when you see those pictures of Rishi Sunak and it's like all the people surrounding him, it's like the West Wing, the huddle. Like, what is it actually like on the trip? Like, are you sat there, like, just on the same plane as him, like, chatting with him? Do you, like, go for a drink with him or anything?
So, if you look at these things, they put these pictures out of the huddles. It's really interesting. We didn't used to take pictures of them or publish them. But there's this curious thing about a PM trip. So you go to a private airfield, the plane is there, you get on the plane, then the PM comes with his massive motorcade, swept in, gets on the plane, all his officials on the plane, and off you go. We then have what's called a huddle. And the huddle is when the Prime Minister will come up the back of the plane. We then crowd around him, and all the journalists that are the travelling pack get to ask a question, right?
Is this before it's taken off, just to be clear? What if there was turbulence?
Well, we'd just strap him in and carry on, I think. But no, what happens is, so you get on the plane and then his people will come down and they'll go, the Prime Minister will be down in 20 minutes. And he comes and sits in a chair, and then we all throw our dictaphones down on the little, the arm of the chair, and off we go. And it's a way in which the press pack can ask him any which question we want. So we ask him on Ukraine, on defence, we asked him about local elections, we asked him about tax. You can ask him anything you want and it's on record. And it goes on for about 25 minutes or so. And the reason they're valuable on the way out like that is because it's a moment where you can actually ask the Prime Minister a load of questions on record. So it's kind of an access thing. You also get a kind of sense of how he is. So on the way from Poland to Berlin, he came back up the plane, that's like an informal thing. We're not writing it all down. It's not on record. We're not using it. But he just comes and has a little bit of a chat. I can tell you, because we've talked a lot about how he seems, right? I haven't seen him as pepped up like that, genuinely, and I've been on a few trips with him since the early days of his premiership. He was properly in a good mood, like genuinely in a good mood. There was a bit of laughing and it felt real. He looked like he was enjoying it. Honestly, I've not seen him like that since right at the beginning when he was first Prime Minister and we were on the trip to Indonesia, and that was the G20, and he seemed properly kind of enjoying the job. And he looked to me, for all this stuff about, are we having a summer election? That was not a man that is ready to give up the keys to number 10, right? And then he talked a bit about kind of what it was like with Donald Tusk and how was Stoltenberg and what does he think of Schultz. And so he kind of gives you a bit of a flavour about what it's like meeting everyone. So with Donald Tusk, who knew that Donald Tusk is a massive Margaret Thatcher fan, right? Did you know that? No, neither did I until the Prime Minister told me about how they'd had this chat.
Well, the Poles generally are pretty appreciative because she was one of the first to really go over and recognise Lech Walesa and stuff like that.
See, Ruth knows her stuff.
She saw the advance of freedom and thought that that was worth backing, irrespective if it came from the left rather than the right.
Apparently, he gave Donald Tusk a photo of Tusk with Thatcher in the 80s because Donald Tusk was organising students to come and celebrate her arrival in Poland in the 1980s. Like, who knew? So he talked a bit about that.
She was the first foreign leader to go and meet with Walesa and sort of give backing and prop him up and stuff like that. If I'm remembering my history
correct.
Properly.
I didn't know it. Ruth did. There we go, Jess. She's so clever.
I'm not a Thatcher fangirl. That is not my politics. But in terms of some of the international stuff that you did, you sort of forget that at that time the kind of the boldness of both Reagan and Thatcher in terms of working with people in countries that had been behind the Iron Curtain and the people that they lent their backing to and how important that backing was, just how big a country the UK and the US was and felt at that time was enormous.
So apparently they talked about that. And he also reminded us that Schultz, I forgot this, but they were both finance ministers during the pandemic, so they've got kind of a bit of history. And then he also revealed to us that when he goes to see Meloni, Italian Prime Minister Meloni, she likes to go outside for an Aperol spritz and a cigarette. They have a chat outside.
I just can't imagine Rishi Sunak standing with someone smoking a fag and drinking an Aperol. He must look awkward.
Well, no, he wasn't smoking a fag. He wouldn't smoke a fag.
No, I don't think he was smoking a fag, but even him.
Don't you quite enjoy that image, though?
I do quite enjoy that.
She's there with her Aperol and he's...
I mean, I'd enjoy it more if it was from the centre of politics.
You said something about the booze trolley. I've always wondered, do they feed you booze?
Right, okay, so there is a booze trolley. I remember once when we went to Russia with Cameron in 2012, the trolley was nearly drunk dry on the way back. And I was 10 weeks pregnant at the time. And so I had to just avoid this trolley.
10 weeks? You wouldn't even have announced you were pregnant. You'd have to pretend you were on Lent or something. Yeah.
Yeah, I was like that, like tipping it into my water bottle. No, but there is a drinks trolley on the plane. I never drink on the way out. To put it into context, you leave home at 7 a.m. in the morning and you are still working at 2 a.m. that evening or getting to bed at 2 a.m. the following day, having been to Poland, Berlin, had a press conference. They're mental, but in a brilliant way. I am not complaining. So my rule is I never drink on the way out. Drinks I had on the way back, but on the way out, you see, you do the huddle and then you've got to write up everything. And so it's everyone's frantically
Aren't you all
working.
just writing the same story, though? I sort of...
Yeah.
I feel for lobby journalists sometimes because I'm just a bit like, how does anyone ever get a scoop or anything? Because you're all just getting the same information at the same moment.
Yeah. So
is it just who can type fastest?
Yeah. No, but the point is that is not the scoop. And the challenge is for us lot when we get out there and then you get the question at the press conferences, can you make some news or some new information? And you partly kind of work out what your question at the press conference is going to be about by what he said in the huddle. So what has he said off camera that is actually newsworthy that you put it on camera? You try and get him to say it on camera as well. My final thought on this is we've talked about Sunak's week. Do we think President Putin is having a dysfunctional week as the West rallies around Ukraine? Jess?
I think that he was expecting it to be different. The thing about Putin that we should never underestimate is that while we're reacting to the things that have happened this week, President Putin is both thinking about 300 years ago and 300 years in the future. The man plays an incredibly long game of chess. I mean, I think that it has been a bad week for him, and I think that he was expecting it differently, because it looked like the US deal was, I mean, it took a long enough time, as Ruth has said, but it seemed like it might go the other way when you've got people like David Cameron sort of having argy-bargy with different senators and absolute Trump loons taking to the airways to say that they should stop funding Ukraine and things. I think that they thought it might go a different way. He is having a dysfunction this week, and it must be hard, and it is going to be hard for him in an already struggling situation, but he's now thinking of the next move.
The man is utterly strategic, and in terms of what Jess says about having that long-term vision for uniting a greater Russia and all the rest of it, that is absolutely his goal, his legacy building, all the rest of it. So I think this had been held up enough that he expected it to be held up for longer. This is a bad week for him, but I also think that having seen the Democratic Party get this through, his interest in the US election will soar like exponentially in terms of Russian interference.
Yeah, so look, the West getting its act together. The Prime Minister talked about the kind of danger of Russian expansionism past the borders into other countries. And his argument was Ukraine has to succeed, and the world getting behind the message this week. So I think we can all agree that President Putin is probably pretty pissed off at the moment. Let's pause there. Coming up, your messages and questions. Okay, welcome back. Look, we're just seeing on our phones a news alert saying that the power sharing agreement in the Scotland government could be about to collapse. It looks like Scotland's First Minister, Hamza Yusuf, is going to end what's known as the Butte House Agreement. Now, we're recording this on Thursday morning. The story's undoubtedly going to develop over the coming hours and days. That means he loses his working majority in Holyrood. Just a very quick bit of background to explain. In the 2021 Scottish election, the SNP were just one seat short of a majority. Now, the Green Party were the only other pro-independence party, and they teamed up with the Green Party in a coalition deal. Now, that included policy commitments on some controversial areas like gender recognition, housing, climate. But it sounds like this deal has or is about to collapse. Ruth, it's happening on your home turf. What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, this looks like a pretty bitter divorce. We've heard from one of the Green co-leaders, Lorna Slater, who was a minister in that agreement. She's calling Hamza Yusuf weak. She's saying that he's not to be trusted, that he's thoroughly hopeless, that it's an act of political cowardice by the SNP. They're selling out future generations. So I think it's fair to say that this isn't a velvet divorce. This isn't a conscious uncoupling like Gwyneth Paltrow and Chris Martin. I mean, this is a bitter doozy. This was all about Nicola Sturgeon wanting to have a pro-independence majority in the Parliament so she could claim that she would get another independence referendum back in 2021. And the particular area of interest that she was playing to was the Westminster press. It was the London press, because the difference that one seat would make between whether the kind of UK establishment would say, yes, she gets to have a referendum, or she should get to have a referendum, she's got the moral authority to have it or not, was huge. So she wanted to cobble together this pro-independence majority to say that that was the same mandate as the SNP had back in 2011 when they got a majority by themselves. It's quite an odd bar to set yourself, because our electoral system is a proportional one. You're actually kind of not supposed to get a majority because of the way it was designed, the additional member system. But irrespective of that, that doesn't seem to be serving either party particularly well, because we've seen that actually the question of independence has dropped way down the agenda. The SNP are trying to keep it alive. They're trying to use it as an election issue for the general election coming up, but the public aren't buying it. So it's not as if they've been necessarily well served by the Greens. What interests me is whether the Greens are so upset by this breakup, and they were already going to take it to their members. Ditching the climate targets in Scotland was the last straw for them. They were going to take it to their members and have their members vote on this, and it looks like the SNP have jumped the gun in case the Green membership opted to leave. They've kicked them out first. But what's really interesting to me is, are they so angry that they will vote with the other opposition parties in Holyrood against the SNP, or not? Because even when they weren't in government, they were pretty willing allies of the SNP. And it'll be really interesting as we go forward to find out whether they want to exact revenge or whether they're going to be more independent-minded than they have previously been in previous parliaments.
So the Scottish Government ditched, as Ruth was saying, the flagship climate change targets. That was pretty humiliating for the Green Party. So it looks like Yusuf is kind of walking before he gets dumped anyway. I mean, it comes, doesn't it, Jess, at a time for Hamza Yusuf where he's already got quite a lot of problems. There's the embezzlement charges against Peter Murrell, who is Nicola Sturgeon's husband and the former chief exec of the SNP. All of that swirling, all of that bad politics and atmospherics for Yusuf. And he's also got the problem with the Labour Party's march against him in the run-up to this general election. And now it looks like the Greens and he have fallen out as well.
I just think Hamza Yusuf essentially just looks weaker and weaker. It was really hard when Nicola Sturgeon was the leader because it was like she was the salt air. And if you said anything bad about her, it was like you were one of those protesters throwing like blood across the flag. Her going and, you know, the problems that she's faced since she has stood down, Hamza Yusuf has not in any way, it seems, been able to sort of wear those clothes of power and confidence. And it's showing.
I think today was a sign of weakness from Hamza Yusuf. He had to pull the trigger before he was dumped. But his big difficulty is not everybody in the SNP were fully behind Nicola Sturgeon's idea to bring the Greens into government anyway, and it's got less and less popular within his party as well as within the country as it's gone on. So while kicking them out looks in some ways that it might be a power move from Hamza Yusuf, actually it just reminds people that he was the only one out of the three leadership candidate that wanted to keep this agreement. And he only kind of scraped over the line with 52% in the final round of voting.
Let's answer some of your questions. At the start of the show, we played you this voice note from Justine. Let's hear it.
Can you explain what goes on behind the scenes when a constituency party is choosing a new candidate to be an MP? And given some of the more rum antics we've seen in the present parliament, what would an MP have to do to not be reselected?
I think that's a reference to Mark Menzies, who we talked about extensively. And also, Ruth, you were spot on, weren't you? You said, I think he's going to have to resign within a week. Well, he did about 4 days after resigning from the Conservative Party and saying he wouldn't stand in the next general election. That still does make him an MP. So I guess what Justine's getting at there is, what do you have to do to sort of end your career as an MP? And John sent us this email to electoraldysfunction@sky.uk along the same lines. This is what John said. How much does having a history matter in entering politics? For instance, if you slept around a lot, taken drugs, or made any sort of mistake, should that hold you back? And how do you manage the impact of media exposure on your families? Bloody hell, that's a good question, isn't it? I mean, Keir Starmer being asked repeatedly whether he'd taken drugs at university by Harry Cole from The Sun the other day, and he kept going, I had a good time. I had a good time. Jess, Ruth, who wants to go first? How does selection work, and does it matter if you've got a bit of a past? Who wants to go first?
So, does it matter if you've had a bit of a past? It does if you lie about it. Is the truth, it will be found out. The truth will always be found out. It doesn't matter at all. They usually get asked at a selection process if you've got any skeletons. And I said that, you know, I mean, I admitted that I'd taken drugs, and I admitted it publicly when I was first elected. And they were like, oh, no, we meant, like, did you harbour a political prisoner? And I was like, well, I've had lodgers. I don't think so. Not intentionally have I harboured a political prisoner, or, like, you know, backed an African coup, or, like, you know, I don't think I've done any of those things. But it's the question you get asked more than the abuse that you get. Like, people do say, like, how do you cope with the abuse? But more than anything, people say, oh, what will they find this stuff out? It doesn't matter if you're honest about it. Tell a story so people can't sell a story is what I would say. As you know, the bar is usually criminal and money, funnily enough, that the public actually don't like. Yeah, like having lived a normal life, that's fine. And in selections, they work in two different ways. So some selections, it's stitched up, basically. Like, let's be honest, that favoured candidates of the leadership of your party, you know, that there is a way that they can make it so that, you know, the local party do get to decide, but it can be quite well managed, stage managed, so that their person gets in. However, the vast majority of cases, it is just usually these days, and this has changed, it used to be much more sort of Westminster bods and spads, special advisors being put in, like, you know, northern seats or whatever. It's much more now likely to be a local person, works locally, been a teacher in the local school, or it's much more likely that they go out and they show the local party that they are going to win. That's how you win a selection. And you can easily get deselected. You don't even have to, like, you know, be ringing about the bad men at 3 a.m. If your local party are annoyed at you because they don't think you're a particularly good constituency MP, you know, there's all sorts of processes in most parties to trigger you losing the selection battle. It's quite hard to do to get rid of a sitting MP from a local party's perspective, but it's not impossible.
Yeah, every party has the ability, if you think your MP is crap, or they've upset people, or they've got fallen in love with the London lifestyle and they're never back in the constituency, or whatever it is. And that's one of the things that sometimes gets them. You're not seen locally enough. And I do have a lot of sympathy for MPs that are down flogging their guts out, sort of Monday to Thursday, coming back up the road either very late Thursday night or Friday. And then they've only got their weekend to be seen in the constituency. So they have to work all weekend as well, and then get back on the train or on the flight from bits of Scotland back down on a Monday morning. So you know, it's not an easy life. I know you'll never get any sympathy for MPs, like the world's smallest violins play for them, but it is not an easy life to try and keep everybody happy. In terms of whether you have a history, firstly, I'm so glad when I was at university that camera phones didn't exist. Just because I did daft things when I was a teenager that daft teenagers do. And social media, I mean, Facebook and Friends Reunited and Bebo and stuff like that was around when I was still quite young. That's how old I am. But in terms of kind of Twitter, where you word vomit your thoughts every, 20 times a day, didn't exist until I was getting to the point where I was thinking about standing. So I was a bit naturally more careful. But yeah, you've seen people like, Mari Black, when she stood or first got elected, there were papers that ran stuff that she'd said when she was 14 about, getting drunk on, it was either Wicked or Mad Dog or something like that. Like a kind of, an underage drink. And you're just kind of thinking, like, does that mean she cannot vote on a law? Like, it doesn't matter?
You're allowed to be real, right? You're allowed to be real.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they want real. They don't want some shiny, tassely loafered, pinky ringed, like, Tristan, like, being dropped into the red wall. And for a bit, that's what the Tory party were trying to do. Rupert, Quentin, and Tristan were being dropped everywhere, and they were getting roundly and soundly beaten in local elections because they might have been the smartest guy in the room, but like they weren't real.
Tristan, I'm gonna literally. That's the best insult I've ever heard. Pinky ring.
You know the ones in the shiny,
we know them.
Loafers and the pinky ring.
We're walking around Westminster with them. Pinky ring Tristram. I'm going to start making T-shirts for them.
Yeah, but they don't want that. They want real people.
Also, in the general population, not everyone's name is Keir. In the Labour Party, every second man is called Keir.
That is very true. Now, I need to ask you both the very important question of what are you doing this weekend, Ruth?
I am, hopefully, fingers crossed, getting my stitches out. So that's the next sort of tentpole on this. And I'm getting the painters and decorators in, and that is not a euphemism.
I'm going to Cyprus tomorrow.
Oh, I'm going to the theatre. Angelo's taking me to watch something like The Long Day's Journey into the Night or something like that, which has got Brian Cox in. And I love him because I'm obsessed with Succession. Can I just say, though, hand on heart, and this is said with absolute truth, it has been a weird sort of, when buses all come at once. I go to the theatre once in 5 years, and I've gone 4 times since we started this podcast. It is not normal for me. Now, we'll be in your feeds a bit later next week. We'll be recording at about 11 a.m. on Friday, because that's going to let us get our heads around the various election results, and then the episode's going to drop later in the afternoon. It's going to be absolutely mega. We'll try and answer some of your questions on that episode too. You can reach us on WhatsApp 07934 200 444. Send an email to electoraldysfunction@sky.uk. Thank you for listening. If you like it, share it with your mates. Goodbye, and I can't wait till next week.
Bye.
Bye.